Title: The Shadow House. The night air was thick and cold, unusual for October in Atlanta, and the streets of Old Fourth Ward were silent. Terrell, a 17-year-old local, was walking alone, his breath fogging up in the chill. He'd been hearing the stories about the old Pine Street complex all his life. People said it was haunted, cursed, the Shadow House. Strange things had happened there as long as anyone could remember, and the bravest locals avoided it after sundown. Tyrell thought they were just stories, so he decided to prove everyone wrong. As he reached Pine Street, the building loomed ahead of him, barely visible under the pale moonlight. The old brick complex looked abandoned, windows cracked or boarded, weeds growing up from the foundation. Tyrell felt a shiver crawl up his spine, but he kept walking, determined. "Ain't no ghosts," he whispered to himself, trying to shake off the unease as he pushed open the rusted gate. The gate creaked loudly, and the sound echoed into the night, almost as if the old building were sighing awake. The courtyard was overgrown, littered with trash and broken glass. Tyrell's footsteps crunched as he walked, and each step sounded louder than the last. He stopped, glancing around, but the street was empty. He took out his phone, flipped on the flashlight, and headed toward the entrance. Inside the hallway was even colder. The smell of mildew and decay filled the air. So strong it was hard to breathe. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing dark stains that looked too much like claw marks. The wooden floor groaned beneath his weight, and his footsteps echoed down the empty hall. Tyrell glanced at the walls, noticing faded photographs in broken frames. They looked like family photos, but the faces were blurred, distorted. He felt a chill run through him and wondered why anyone would leave those pictures behind. As he walked, he noticed the silence thickening around him, a heavy, unnatural stillness. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling, when suddenly a soft sound broke the silence. It was faint, like a child's laughter, echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. "Hello," he called, his voice coming out quieter than he'd intended. He waited, but the laughter stopped, replaced by silence so intense it hurt his ears. He was about to turn around when he heard it again, a soft giggle, followed by a low whisper that he couldn't quite make out. Tyrell took a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But the sound grew louder, almost playful, and seemed to be coming from one of the rooms just ahead. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest, and reached for the doorknob. As he touched the cold metal, the door swung open on its own, revealing a room with only a single dusty chair in the middle. On the wall opposite him, shadows moved, no, shifted, forming shapes that looked like people, their limbs long and twisted. The shadows seemed to be reaching out, clawing at the walls, and as Tyrell watched, frozen in place, the shadows turned their heads to look at him. He stumbled back, his phone clattering to the floor, the flashlight casting long, eerie beams across the room. For a moment he thought he saw something in the corner, a figure, tall and thin, with piercing red eyes that glowed in the dark. It didn't move, but Tyrell felt its gaze bore into him as if it were trying to pull him in. His breathing grew shallow, panic setting in, and he quickly picked up his phone, backing away from the door. As he turned to leave, the laughter returned, louder this time, and he could hear footsteps echoing behind him. The sound grew closer, heavy and deliberate, like someone or something was following him. Tyrell broke into a run, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallways as he darted toward the stairs. But as he reached the stairwell, he felt a cold, clammy hand close around his shoulder. He froze, every nerve in his body screaming, and slowly turned around. There, standing behind him, was the figure. Closer now. Its face was pale and hollow, with sunken eyes that seemed to burn with a cold, dark fire. It leaned closer, whispering in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping against the ground. "Don't leave." Tyrell pulled free, adrenaline surging through him, and stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping over his own feet. As he reached the bottom, he heard more footsteps, coming from everywhere, closing in on him. He burst through the front doors, his heart racing, and kept running, not daring to look back until he was blocks away. When he finally stopped, he looked back, expecting to see the building looming behind him, but Pine Street was empty. Where the shadow house had stood was now just an overgrown lot, dark and silent. Tyrell's pulse pounded in his ears as he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. He reached into his pocket for his phone, but it wasn't there. He must have dropped it in his panic back inside the building. He thought about going back for it, but something in his gut told him to leave it, to never return to Pine Street. The next day, he tried to tell his friends, but they just laughed, saying the old complex had been torn down years ago. They wouldn't believe him, no matter what he said. But Tyrell knew what he'd seen. And every so often, late at night, he'd feel that same chill creeping up his spine, hear those same footsteps in the distance. And when he walked by Pine Street, he always looked away just in case.